The California Gold Rush was not simply a story of opportunity. It was a violent acceleration machine that turned a recently conquered Mexican province into a global destination, and it began in a place that was already someone's home. That is the tension at the center of the story. The phrase gold rush still carries a glittering promise: sudden wealth, open land, a new life somewhere beyond the mountains. But before it became a national myth, before it pulled ships around Cape Horn and wagons across the California Trail, before presidents, merchants, miners, and governments understood what had been found, the place itself had another meaning. The valley was known to the Nisenan as Coloma. California State Parks translates that name as a beautiful valley. The name matters because it interrupts the familiar map. Most Americans first encounter this story through the place name Coloma, through Sutter's mill, through the image of James W. Marshall noticing gold in a sawmill channel on January 24, 1848. Those names are real, and they will matter, but they are not the beginning of the landscape. They are later layers placed over a native homeland, a river valley in the Sierra foothills along the South Fork of the American River in what is now El Dorado County, California. Today, the discovery site is preserved as Marshall Gold Discovery State Historic Park. Visitors encounter a commemorated landscape, a place of markers, trails, reconstructed memory, and public history. The California Office of Historic Preservation lists the gold discovery site as a California historical landmark. Those designations tell us that the place became nationally important because of what happened there in 1848. But preservation can also flatten time. It can make a location look as if it had been waiting for its famous event. Coloma was not waiting. It was a valley with a name before the rush gave it a legend. It was part of the world of the Nisenan people before it became part of the vocabulary of American expansion. The South Fork of the American River was not merely a scenic boundary or an industrial resource. It was water running through a lived place. The valley was not a blank stage on which settlers, entrepreneurs, and miners would soon act. It was already inhabited, known, and meaningful. That is why the opening of this story has to slow down before the discovery. If we move too quickly to the flakes of gold, we inherit the pace of the rush itself. We start to see the West the way the rush trained outsiders to see it, as resource, as opportunity, as destination, as claim. But the place called Coloma asks for a different first image. Not a crowd of miners, not a boomtown street, not a pan in a stream. A river valley before the avalanche of movement. The South Fork of the American River flows through the Sierra Nevada foothills, a landscape that would soon be pulled into a continental and global system of desire. After the discovery, California would be connected with Atlantic ports, Pacific shipping routes, overland trails, and the Isthmus of Panama. People would come from the eastern United States, Latin America, China, Europe, Australia, and elsewhere. The rush would help transform San Francisco from a small port town into a boom city. It would reshape Sacramento and the inland routes tied to mining country. It would hasten California's admission to the Union on September 9, 1850. But before all of that, there was a narrower valley and a river. There was the site where John Sutter's sawmill was being built, roughly 40 miles from Sutter's home base. There was a work project tied to Sutter's larger world of Sutter's Fort and New Helvetia. There was James W. Marshall, a carpenter and sawmill operator working for Sutter. And there was a channel cut for ordinary industrial use, a tailrace designed to carry water away from the sawmill mechanism. The future turning point was hidden inside that ordinary machinery. This is one reason the gold rush has such narrative power. It did not begin as a formal expedition to unlock a continent. It began in the infrastructure of settlement, a sawmill meant to process timber, support construction, and extend Sutter's enterprise into the foothills. The gold was not first announced from a capital city or revealed by a government survey. It appeared in the work channel of a mill, in a place where water, labor, wood, and ambition already met. Still, if the story is told only from the moment of discovery, it becomes too neat. The discovery did not merely reveal gold. It revealed how quickly a place could be renamed by outsiders, absorbed into new political meanings, and transformed by migration. Within the same historical moment, California was being transferred from Mexico to the United States through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848, only days after Marshall found gold. A recently conquered province was about to become a prize of global significance. That overlap gives the gold rush its sharp edge. The gold did not appear in an empty frontier, and it did not appear in a stable political landscape. California was already a place of native nations, Spanish-speaking Californios, Mexican-era settlements, missions, ranchos, and military occupation before United States statehood. The discovery landed inside that complexity and then accelerated everything. Acceleration is the key word. The gold rush did not create every force that would reshape the American West, but it made them move faster. It intensified migration. It magnified land hunger. It made the Pacific Coast central to American economic and political power. It encouraged thousands to cross dangerous routes in search of wealth. It pulled labor and capital toward mines, towns, ports, and supply networks. It also intensified violence and dispossession against Native Californians. The later damage to Native communities was not incidental to the rush. The Smithsonian National Museum of American History describes destroyed Indian villages, redirected waterways, depleted food supplies, and the near destruction of the Nisenan among Native cultures affected by the rush. That fact belongs near the beginning, not as an afterthought, because the valley where the famous discovery occurred was Nisenan homeland. The story of opportunity for some was also the story of catastrophe for others. A calm telling of the gold rush has to hold both truths at once. For many migrants, California became a place of imagined possibility. For merchants, shippers, innkeepers, bankers, suppliers, and miners, gold created new openings and new fortunes. For the United States, it helped turn the Pacific Coast from a distant edge into a central arena of national power. But for Native people in California, the rush brought invasion, violence, village destruction, displacement, and the collapse of food systems. The same event that made California a magnet also made survival more precarious for the people whose homelands became mining country. Coloma, a beautiful valley, is therefore more than a prelude. It is a test of how the story will be told. If we begin with the beauty of the valley only to decorate the discovery, we miss the point. If we begin with the discovery and treat indigenous presence as background, we repeat the erasure built into the rush itself. The valley has to be seen as a homeland before it becomes a landmark. Marshall Gold Discovery State Historic Park now protects the site where the event is remembered. Its public significance rests on a moment in 1848 when gold was found at Sutter's sawmill in Coloma on the South Fork of the American River. But the park also marks a deeper contradiction. A place can be preserved because it changed the nation, while the people most deeply rooted there suffered from the change. That contradiction will follow the entire story. It will be present when rumor becomes presidential fact in James K. Polk's annual message to Congress on December 5, 1848. It will be present when the 49ers begin moving in large numbers by spring 1849. It will be present in the rise of San Francisco and the transformation of Sacramento, in the state seal bearing the word Eureka, and in the routes that connected California to the world. It will also be present in the mines themselves, as individual placer methods gave way to sluices, hydraulic mining, hard rock mining, and later dredging, leaving rivers and sediments changed for generations. But all of that begins with a place that should not be reduced to what outsiders found in it. Before California was a gold-bearing prize, before Coloma became a symbol of sudden fortune, before Sutter's Mill became one of the most famous industrial sites in American memory, there was Coloma, a beautiful valley, a Nisenan homeland, a river, a sawmill under construction. And in the Tailrace, where water ran away from the mechanism, a few small pieces of metal were about to reorder the American West. The Tailrace is where the story narrows. After the valley, after the river, after Coloma as a homeland, and Coloma as a place not yet known around the world, we come to a work channel beside a sawmill. It was not a grand stage. It was not a mine. It was not a treasury or a government office or a port crowded with ships. It was a practical feature of a practical machine, a channel cut to carry water away after that water had done its work. At Sutter's sawmill on the South Fork of the American River, the machinery depended on moving water. Water was the power source. It could turn a wheel, drive the saw, and make lumber production possible in a place where human ambition was already pressing hard against distance, terrain, and supply. The tailrace was part of that system. Water came in to move the mechanism, and then it had to go out. The channel that carried it away was the tailrace. That is where James W. Marshall noticed something unusual on January 24, 1848. Marshall was a carpenter and sawmill operator working for John A. Sutter. Sutter's name was already tied to a larger colonial project in the Sacramento Valley, Sutter's Fort and New Helvetia, his home base and center of operations. The mill at Coloma was being built roughly 40 miles from that base, not because Coloma was famous, but because a growing settlement needed materials. Timber mattered. Lumber mattered. A sawmill was infrastructure. It was a way to turn forests, water power, labor, and capital into boards, buildings, fences, storage, and expansion. Before it became a monument in American memory, Sutter's Mill was meant to solve a supply problem. That point is easy to lose because the discovery overwhelms everything that came before it. We remember the gold, not the business plan. We remember the glitter, not the saw. But the ordinary purpose of the mill is part of what makes the discovery so powerful. The gold rush did not begin with a formal expedition sent out to locate mineral wealth. It began inside an attempt to build capacity for Sutter's world. A sawmill was being constructed to feed growth. Then, in the channel where the used water drained away, Marshall saw flakes of metal. The physical setting matters. A tailrace was not a decorative ditch. It was a working part of the mill, a place where current, gravel, sand, and exposed earth could come together. As water moved through the system, it could disturb and reveal material in the channel. Marshall's attention to that channel was the attention of someone responsible for making the mill function. He was not standing outside history waiting for a symbol. He was inspecting a worksite, and what he found was small. That is another detail worth holding on to. The discovery that helped reorder the American West did not look, at first, like an empire. It looked like a few pieces of metal in a water channel. The scale of the object and the scale of the consequence were wildly unequal. In the moment, the find could fit in a hand. In time, it would pull people across the California Trail, around Cape Horn, and through the Isthmus of Panama. It would help transform San Francisco, intensify the pressure on Sacramento and the interior, accelerate California's path toward statehood, and draw migrants from the eastern United States, Latin America, China, Europe, Australia, and beyond. But on January 24, 1848, those consequences were still hidden inside the fact of discovery. Marshall's first problem was not migration. It was identification. Was the metal really gold? If it was, what did that mean for the mill, for Sutter, for the land around the South Fork of the American River, and for everyone whose life was already rooted there? The answer, as it unfolded, would be larger than any one person could control. John Sutter had reason to see the discovery as dangerous as well as promising. His enterprise depended on order, labor, land claims, and production. A gold strike could bring chaos. If word spread, workers might abandon jobs, outsiders might arrive, property arrangements might be challenged, and the slow accumulation of settlement infrastructure might be overtaken by something faster and less governable. Gold could make a man wealthy in theory. In practice, it could also destroy the conditions that made ordinary business possible. That tension sits at the center of the discovery. Sutter's Mill was built to extend a settlement economy. The gold found there helped break that economy open. Coloma's distance from Sutter's fort also matters. Roughly 40 miles was close enough to be connected to Sutter's ambitions, but far enough to remind us that this was not a single compact town. Sutter's operations stretched across a landscape of rivers, foothills, native homelands, and routes of movement. The sawmill at Coloma linked the Sacramento Valley to the Sierra foothills. It tied the need for lumber to the power of the South Fork of the American River. And because gold was found there, that local connection became the first thread in a much larger web. The discovery site is now preserved as Marshall Gold Discovery State Historic Park in El Dorado County. That preservation gives the place a fixed identity. Here's where it happened. But in 1848, nothing was fixed. California itself was in a state of political transition. The region had been part of Mexico. The Mexican-American War had brought United States military occupation and unsettled claims of sovereignty. The ground beneath the discovery was not just geologically charged, it was politically unstable. That instability helps explain why a small find could become explosive. Gold does not transform a region by shining. It transforms a region when news of it moves through existing pressures, land hunger, migration routes, imperial expansion, labor demands, commercial speculation, and the belief that sudden wealth might be available to ordinary people willing to risk everything. The flakes in the tailrace mattered because they entered a world already primed for movement. The discovery also came at a moment when information could travel unevenly but powerfully. At first, a find like this could be rumor, local knowledge, guarded information, or campfire talk. But rumor did not have to reach everyone at once to begin changing behavior. It only had to be credible enough to make some people leave what they were doing. In a fragile labor system, that was already dangerous. In a frontier economy tied to construction, farming, trade, and transportation, it could become destabilizing quickly. The mill itself becomes, in that sense, a symbol of unintended consequences. Its purpose was to cut lumber. Its tailrace exposed gold. Its workers and owners stood at the edge of a transformation they had not designed. A structure meant to support settlement became the origin point for a migration that would overwhelm settlements. A channel meant to carry water away from a mechanism became the place where a new mechanism began, the mechanism of gold fever, speculation, movement, and conquest. It is tempting to tell this as a clean origin story. Marshall finds gold, the world rushes in, California changes forever. But the real sequence is more uneasy. A carpenter notices metal in a mill channel. A landholder hopes to manage the consequences. A remote worksite becomes a magnet. An indigenous homeland becomes famous under another name. A local discovery begins to connect with national ambitions and global roots. And just beyond the tailrace, history was moving with almost impossible timing. Marshall found gold on January 24, 1848. Only days later, on February 2nd, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo would be signed. That treaty would transfer California from Mexico to the United States. So the discovery did not happen in a settled American state, nor in an empty wilderness, nor in a simple frontier vacuum. It happened at the edge of a conquered province, at the very moment its political future was being rewritten. The gold in the tailrace was small enough to miss. The timing was not. The gold in the tailrace was small enough to miss. The timing was not. When James W. Marshall noticed those pieces of metal on January 24, 1848, California's political fate was already being decided far from the South Fork of the American River. The sawmill at Coloma stood in a place with its own layered history. Niçonan homeland, Mexican territory, a region of ranchos and settlements, a place already touched by military occupation and imperial ambition. But within days of Marshall's discovery, the formal language of diplomacy would give that transformation a date. On February 2, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. With that treaty, California was transferred from Mexico to the United States. That is the contradiction at the heart of the gold rush. The discovery that would make California a global magnet did not occur after long American settlement, and it did not happen in a stable political landscape. It happened just as sovereignty over the region was changing hands. Gold was found in a province that had only just been conquered, at almost the exact moment it was being absorbed into the United States. The timing is so close that it can feel almost unreal. January 24th, Marshall finds gold in the tailrace of Sutter's sawmill in Coloma. February 2nd, the treaty is signed. Between those dates lay only a few days, but across those few days, the meaning of the discovery changed. The flakes in the mill channel were not simply a local curiosity. They were about to become mineral evidence that the United States had acquired not only territory, but a prize of global significance. To understand why that mattered, California has to be seen as more than a blank space on an American map. Before the rush, it was home to native nations, including the Niçonan in the valley known as Coloma. It was also part of the world shaped by Spanish-speaking Californios, Mexican-era settlements, missions, ranchos, and local systems of land and labor. The treaty did not create California out of nothing. It changed the government, claiming authority over a place already inhabited, already named, already used, already fought over. The gold rush would later be remembered through images of movement, wagons crossing the overland trails, ships rounding Cape Horn, travelers crossing the Isthmus of Panama, miners bending over pans in cold streams. But before all that motion, there was a legal and political transfer. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo placed California within the expanding reach of the United States. Marshall's discovery then made that transfer feel urgent, valuable, and irreversible. This is why the phrase conquered province matters. California was not simply purchased in a peaceful commercial transaction, nor was it discovered by Americans at the moment gold appeared. It entered the United States in the aftermath of war with Mexico. The treaty marked the formal transfer, but the human landscape did not reset when the document was signed. Native Californians remained on their homelands. Californios remained in towns, ranchos, and communities shaped by Mexican rule. Sutter's Fort and New Helvetia remained part of the interior world of settlement, labor, ambition, and exchange. The American flag did not erase what had come before. But gold gave the new authorities, and the people soon rushing toward California, a powerful reason to treat the land as a prize. That prize would soon be described in economic terms, political terms, and national terms. Yet in the first days after the discovery, the full scale was not obvious. A few people knew what Marshall had found. John Sutter understood that the news could be disruptive. The sawmill was supposed to support his larger ambitions, not invite a stampede. But the location of the discovery now mattered in a new way. Coloma was no longer only a work site, roughly 40 miles from Sutter's home base. It was a place where mineral wealth and national expansion overlapped. The treaty and the discovery also changed how Americans could imagine the Pacific coast. Before gold, California was distant from the older centers of United States power. It lay beyond long overland routes, beyond deserts and mountains, beyond maritime journeys that could take ships around Cape Horn or across Pacific approaches. It was important, but still remote. Gold altered that distance. It did not move California physically closer to New York, Boston, Missouri River departure points, or the Atlantic world, but it made the cost of reaching it seem worth paying. A territory that had been on the edge of national awareness began moving toward the center. Not because its rivers had changed, or its mountains had changed, or its people had suddenly appeared, but because outsiders had learned that wealth could be extracted from its earth and waterways. The value attached to California shifted almost overnight. In the language of expansion, this was the moment when geography became destiny. In the lived experience of people already there, it was the beginning of a much harsher acceleration. The treaty did not announce a gold rush. It did not need to. The discovery had not yet become official national knowledge. Rumors would have to travel. Reports would have to be tested. Skeptics would have to be convinced. But the political ground had been laid. When news of gold moved eastward, it would not be news from a foreign country. It would be news from a newly acquired American possession. That distinction gave the reports a different force. This is one of the reasons the gold rush became more than a mining event. Had gold been found in a region still governed by Mexico, the story would have unfolded through different claims, different diplomatic pressures, different legal arguments, and perhaps different military dangers. Instead, by the time the discovery became widely believed, California was being folded into the United States. Gold and sovereignty arrived together. Each intensified the other. The United States had acquired California. Gold made that acquisition look providential to many Americans. Gold had been found. The treaty made it easier for Americans to imagine that wealth as belonging within their national future. The moral contradictions were present from the beginning. The same event that promised opportunity to migrants also deepened the dispossession of native people and unsettled existing Californio communities. The same discovery that would draw global migration also strengthened the American hold on a region taken from Mexico. The same flakes that glittered in the Tailrace helped turn a local valley into a symbol of continental ambition. That symbolism would grow later, after the first reports hardened into belief. But even before the rush reached its full force, the discovery was already tied to questions of power. Who had the authority to govern the land? Who could claim the minerals? Who would profit from movement, trade, labor, and law? Who would be pushed aside as the meaning of California changed? The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo answered one question at the level of nations. California would pass from Mexico to the United States. But it did not answer the questions that gold would raise on the ground. It did not settle what would happen in the mining districts. It did not protect native villages from the violence and disruption that would follow. It did not preserve the earlier social world of California from the flood of newcomers soon to come. It did not slow the imagination of people who would hear of gold and begin to calculate routes west. For the moment, though, the story remained suspended between fact and rumor. In Coloma, gold had been found. In diplomacy, California had been transferred. But across the wider United States, the discovery had not yet become something a farmer, merchant, sailor, clerk, or laborer could confidently act upon. That required a new kind of confirmation. The treaty made California American territory. The gold made it desirable. But only when the highest levels of government acknowledged the reports would rumor become a force strong enough to move thousands of people. By the end of 1848, the discovery in the Tailrace would no longer be only a local secret or a frontier story passing from mouth to mouth. It would enter Congress, carried by the authority of President James K. Polk, and once that happened, the road to California would begin to fill. The road to California did not fill all at once. It began with belief. By the end of 1848, the discovery at Coloma had already changed the lives of people closest to it. James W. Marshall had found gold in the Tailrace of Sutter's sawmill on January 24th. John Sutter's world around Sutter's Fort and New Helvetia had been pulled into a story larger than any private settlement plan. California itself had passed from Mexico to the United States through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2nd. But for people far away from the South Fork of the American River, the news still had to cross a difficult threshold. It had to become credible. That threshold mattered because the gold rush was not just a reaction to gold. It was a reaction to trusted information about gold. A rumor could excite people. A rumor could circulate through ports, newspapers, military posts, and trading networks. A rumor could make men talk late into the night about leaving home. But rumor alone was a fragile thing. It could be exaggerated, misunderstood, invented, or overtaken by the next report from somewhere else. To uproot a life and aim it toward California required something stronger. On December 5th, 1848, that stronger thing arrived. In his annual message to Congress, President James K. Polk confirmed the reports of California gold. The importance of that moment was not simply that the president mentioned a discovery. It was that the discovery entered the highest official language of the United States government. What had begun in a sawmill tailrace at Coloma became part of national political knowledge. It moved from a remote worksite to regional report to presidential fact. In the quiet machinery of public belief, that was a turning point. Polk's confirmation came at the end of a year already crowded with consequence. The United States had emerged from war with Mexico. California had become part of a new American acquisition. The Pacific Coast, long distant from the centers of United States population and power, suddenly appeared in a different light. It was no longer only a military prize, or a diplomatic result, or a far western province with missions, ranchos, native homelands, Spanish-speaking Californios, and scattered settlements. It was now a place where gold had been officially acknowledged. That distinction changed the scale of the story. Before presidential confirmation, news of the discovery could be treated as frontier talk. Afterward, it carried the weight of federal authority. A farmer in the eastern United States did not need to have seen the South Fork of the American River. A clerk did not need to know James W. Marshall. A sailor did not need to have stood beside the Tailrace. If the president told Congress that the reports were real, then the discovery became something that could be acted upon. Not safely and not wisely in every case, but seriously. This is where the gold rush begins to show its power as an information event. The metal in the ground mattered, but so did the movement of news. Gold could lie in riverbeds and gravel bars for ages without transforming a continent. What changed the American West was the moment when people elsewhere believed that gold was there and believed it enough to move. The message to Congress helped create that belief. It is easy to imagine the confirmation as a simple announcement, but its effects were deeper. It gave thousands of people permission to think of California not as a rumor at the edge of the map, but as a possible destination. It allowed families to discuss departure in practical terms. It encouraged merchants to imagine supply chains. It pushed sailors, wagon owners, outfitters, speculators, and laborers to see opportunity in motion. It turned attention toward routes, overland roads, long sea voyages, and crossings that connected Atlantic ports to the Pacific. The risks remained severe. California was far away from the eastern United States. The routes that would carry gold seekers west were long, expensive, and dangerous. Some would travel overland on the California Trail. Some would sail around Cape Horn, taking the long maritime route from Atlantic ports to the Pacific. Others would combine sea and land, traveling by ship to Panama, crossing the Isthmus of Panama, and then seeking another vessel north toward California. None of these choices were easy. All of them required preparation, money, time, and a willingness to endure uncertainty. That is why credibility mattered so much. A person might gamble on a rumor for a short journey, but California demanded more. It demanded months of travel for many migrants. It demanded leaving farms, shops, families, debts, obligations, and familiar communities. It demanded faith that the destination was real enough to justify the danger. Polk's message did not make the journey safe. It made the idea of the journey plausible, and plausibility in that winter was powerful. The timing also reinforced the contradiction at the center of the gold rush. California had only just been transferred from Mexico to the United States. The ink of diplomacy and the glint of gold belonged to the same historical moment. When Polk confirmed the discovery to Congress, he was not speaking about a settled American state. He was speaking about a newly acquired territory whose political future had not yet been fully defined. Gold transformed that uncertainty into urgency. The United States now had more than a distant Pacific possession. It had a gold-bearing territory at a moment when expansion, statehood, and national power were all in motion. The discovery sharpened the meaning of the conquest. It made California not just land taken in war, but land that people would cross a continent to reach. For Native Californians, including the Nisenan people of the valley known as Coloma, this rising credibility carried danger. A rumor might bring a few outsiders. Official confirmation could help bring thousands. The movement that followed would not unfold across empty space. It would enter homelands, river systems, food sources, and communities that already existed. The presidential message did not create those consequences by itself, but it helped release the migration that would intensify them. For entrepreneurs, the same confirmation suggested possibility. If people came west, they would need tools, food, transport, lodging, information, and credit. The gold rush was never only about miners kneeling in streams with pans. From the beginning, it was also about the systems that carried people toward the mines and supplied them once they arrived. San Francisco and Sacramento would feel that transformation. So would the inland routes leading toward the Sierra foothills. But before those places became symbols of boom and upheaval, the first requirement was belief. By December 5th, belief had been nationalized. The phrase sounds formal, almost cold, but the human result was intensely personal. Somewhere, a man who had dismissed earlier reports may have reconsidered. Somewhere, a family may have weighed whether one son should go. Somewhere, a merchant may have begun planning what goods could be sold to gold seekers. Somewhere, a sailor may have looked at the Pacific not as an abstract ocean, but as a route toward fortune. The president's annual message did not command them to leave. It made leaving imaginable. That is how rumor becomes migration. The confirmation also changed the pace of the story. In January, gold had been found. In February, California had been transferred. Through the rest of the year, news traveled, gathered force, and struggled for credibility. Then, in December, Polk's message gave the discovery a public seal. After that, the waiting period narrowed. Winter would give way to planning. Planning would give way to departure. And by spring 1849, the movement would be large enough to earn a name. Those who came would be remembered as the 49ers, the gold seekers of 1849. Their journeys would turn trails, ports, rivers, and cities into parts of a new Western system. According to the National Park Service, about 25,000 migrants traveled on the California National Historic Trail that year. That surge did not begin with wagons alone. It began with a decision made in the mind that California was real, that the gold was real, and that the risk might be worth taking. A few flakes in a tailrace had become a presidential fact. Once that happened, The American West was no longer waiting at the edge of the nation's imagination. It was calling people toward it, and thousands were preparing to answer. The call had gone out, but answering it required more than excitement. It required motion. After President James K. Polk confirmed the reports of California gold in his annual message to Congress on December 5, 1848, belief began to harden into plans. Men who had heard rumors now had the authority of the presidency behind them. Families, merchants, laborers, farmers, and adventurers could look west and imagine not a rumor, but a destination. By spring 1849, that change in imagination became visible on the ground. The largest migration tied to the gold rush was underway. According to the National Park Service, about 25,000 migrants traveled on the California National Historic Trail that year. The number matters because it shows the discovery at Coloma had escaped the place of its origin. What began as flakes of gold in the tailrace of Sutter's sawmill had become a mass movement across distance. These migrants would be remembered by a name that fixed them to a year: the 49ers. The term did not describe everyone who ever came to California in search of gold. It pointed especially to the gold seekers of 1849, the people who moved after the discovery had been confirmed, after the first rumors had become national news, and after the idea of California gold had entered public life with enough force to pull people away from familiar homes and occupations. The name has a simplicity that can make the movement feel almost orderly. 49ers. A single label, a single year, a single destination. But beneath that name was a vast rearrangement of human intention. Each migrant carried private reasons: debt, ambition, restlessness, hope, fear of being left behind. Yet together, these individual choices became something larger than personal fortune hunting. They became one of the mechanisms by which the American West was rewired. To say that the West was rewired is to say that connections changed. Before the rush, California could still appear distant from the main centers of United States power. It had only recently been transferred from Mexico to the United States through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It was not yet a state. Its political future was still forming. Its cities, roads, ports, and inland settlements did not yet carry the same national weight they would soon acquire. But migration changed distance. When thousands of people began moving toward the same place, trails became corridors. Ports became gateways. River landings, supply points, and settlements became linked to a larger economy of movement. The California National Historic Trail preserves the memory of one of those corridors. It was not simply a line on a map. It represented the overland passage of people, animals, wagons, tools, food, and expectations. The trail became a physical expression of belief in the gold rush. To travel it was to turn a national headline into bodily risk. The people moving overland were not reading about the West from afar. They were entering it step by step, carrying the consequences of the discovery across plains, deserts, rivers, and mountains. The National Park Service figure of about 25,000 migrants on the California National Historic Trail in 1849 gives scale to that transformation. It does not describe a trickle. It describes a surge. And a surge has effects beyond the people who make it. It demands supplies. It spreads information. It creates markets. It marks paths that later travelers can follow. It puts pressure on landscapes and communities already there. In this way, migration was not only an outcome of the gold rush. It was part of the machinery of the gold rush. The 49ers were moving toward mining country, but they were also producing a new geography as they went. California became less an isolated far western possession and more a destination connected to the rest of the United States by repeated human passage. The movement helped turn the Pacific Coast into a central arena of economic and political attention. This mattered because a discovery does not transform a continent by existing alone. Gold in the ground must be imagined, pursued, extracted, bought, sold, shipped, and talked about. The 49ers supplied the human force that made those processes expand. Their movement also changed the meaning of California. In the early months after Marshall's discovery on January 24, 1848, the news had been local and uncertain. By 1849, California had become a magnet. People were not only going west, they were orienting their lives toward a specific promise in the Sierra foothills and the rivers that drained them. Coloma, the South Fork of the American River, Sutter's Fort, San Francisco, Sacramento, and the mining districts all began to fit into a network shaped by gold. That network was not abstract. It was made of bodies in motion and goods in motion. A person leaving for California needed equipment. A wagon required animals. A mining camp required food, clothing, tools, shelter, and transport. A port city required ships and warehouses. An inland gateway required roads and supply routes. Even before a miner found anything, the act of going created economic activity. This is one reason the gold rush transformed more than mining. It reorganized movement itself. The 49ers also reveal how quickly a political event could become a demographic one. California had been made United States territory in 1848. In 1849, large numbers of migrants began moving toward it. The timing compressed conquest, discovery, migration, and state formation into a narrow period. A recently acquired province suddenly seemed essential to the nation's future. Gold did not only lure individuals, it accelerated the integration of California into United States systems of travel, commerce, and government. Yet the name 49ers can also soften the harsher realities of what this movement meant for others. The migrants were entering a region that was not empty. California was home to native nations, Spanish-speaking Californios, Mexican-era settlements, missions, ranchos, and military occupation before United States statehood. The routes that brought opportunity for some carried disruption for others. The gold rush would damage native communities through violence, village destruction, redirected waterways, depleted food supplies, and displacement. That catastrophe belongs fully to the story. The movement of the 49ers was celebrated by many newcomers as a journey toward possibility, but it also formed part of an invasion experienced by native Californians with devastating consequences. This contradiction is central to understanding the gold rush as a turning point. Migration can look heroic when seen from the perspective of those who chose to go. It looks different from the perspective of communities whose lands, food systems, waterways, and futures were overrun by the rush. The same roads that carried dreams also carried pressure. The same wagons that helped connect California to the United States also helped intensify dispossession. The West was rewired, but rewiring is not a neutral act. It changes where power flows. Still, in the spring of 1849, many migrants were focused less on the consequences of their movement than on the chance that awaited them. The word California had changed. It no longer meant only a distant coast or a former Mexican province. It meant gold country. It meant a place where ordinary people imagined that a life could be remade. The discovery had turned geography into promise and promise into migration. The power of the 49ers lies in that conversion. They transformed knowledge into motion. Polk's confirmation had made the gold credible. The migrants made it continental. They made California present in towns and ports far from the Pacific. They made the route west a subject of urgent calculation. How would a person get there? What could be carried? How long would it take? What dangers lay along the way? What path offered the best chance of survival and success? Those questions opened the next layer of the rush. The 49ers were united by a destination, but not by a single road. Some moved overland on the California Trail. Others would choose the long sea voyage around Cape Horn. Still others would combine ocean travel with a crossing of the Isthmus of Panama before boarding another vessel for California. By the time the migration surged, the gold rush had already begun linking wagon roads, Atlantic ports, Pacific shipping, and inland routes into one expanding system of movement toward Gold Mountain. The rush had become a problem of distance. California was now fixed in the minds of thousands as a place where gold could be found, but it still sat on the far side of a continent, a desert, a mountain wall, or an ocean voyage. The 49ers shared a destination, but they did not share a single road. Their choices divided into three great paths: the overland California Trail, the long maritime passage around Cape Horn, and the mixed route by sea to the Isthmus of Panama, across the narrow land bridge, and then by another vessel up the Pacific coast. Each route turned the gold rush into something larger than a mining migration. It connected places that had once seemed distant from one another: Atlantic ports, Missouri River departure points, wagon roads, Pacific harbors, and the Sierra foothills. A discovery in the tailrace of a sawmill had begun to rearrange the map of movement. For many migrants from the United States, the most direct mental image of the journey was overland. The California Trail carried emigrants westward across the continent toward the Pacific slope. By spring 1849, the National Park Service describes about 25,000 migrants traveling on the California National Historic Trail that year. That figure matters because it shows the rush becoming visible not only in California, but along the roads leading to it. Gold had changed the meaning of the trail itself. What had been a path of migration became, for a season, a corridor of urgent speculation. The overland route required people to think in terms of wagons, animals, supplies, and time. It made California reachable, but not close. Migrants had to commit themselves before they could see whether the promise was real. Once they set out, they were bound to a moving community of strangers and neighbors, all aimed toward the same imagined future. The trail was not merely a line across land. It was a mechanism for transferring people, goods, rumors, tools, and ambition from the older centers of the United States toward a newly acquired Western territory. That mattered politically and economically. California had only recently been transferred from Mexico to the United States through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The discovery of gold had given that transfer immediate weight. Now, the movement of wagons gave it physical force. People were not just reading about California or hearing about it in speeches. They were placing it into their lives as a destination. They were selling property, buying provisions, forming companies, and measuring the continent by the possibility of gold. But the trail was only one answer to the problem of distance. Others looked east, toward the sea. From Atlantic ports, such as New York and Boston, gold seekers could board vessels for the long voyage around Cape Horn. This route turned the rush into a maritime event. To reach California by this path, travelers went south down the Atlantic, rounded the southern tip of South America, and then moved north through the Pacific toward the California coast. It was not a short journey, but it had one powerful advantage. It allowed people and cargo to move by ship for almost the entire distance. The Cape Horn route reminds us that the gold rush did not simply pull people west across land. It also pulled shipping into new patterns. The same discovery that filled wagon roads also filled harbors. Ships carried passengers, equipment, merchandise, and expectation. California's gold fields created demand before many migrants had even arrived. A person going to the mines needed tools, clothing, food, and shelter. A merchant going to California needed goods to sell. A ship owner saw opportunity in the movement itself. In that sense, the rush rewarded more than miners. It created a vast supply problem, and wherever there was a supply problem, there were people willing to organize transport, sell passage, carry freight, and speculate on what California would need next. The long voyage around Cape Horn tied California to the commercial life of the Atlantic world. A port city on the eastern seaboard could now feel the force of a discovery made beside the South Fork of the American River. The third route was the most revealing of California's new global position. Some gold seekers traveled by sea to Panama, crossed the Isthmus of Panama by land, and then boarded another vessel on the Pacific side for California. This was a combined route, part maritime and part overland, using the narrowness of Central America to shorten the distance between the Atlantic and the Pacific. The Panama crossing showed the gold rush as a hemispheric event. California was not only connected to the interior of the United States or to Atlantic ports by way of Cape Horn. It was also tied to routes through Latin America and the wider Pacific. The isthmus became a passage point in the rush toward Gold Mountain. People who might never have thought of Panama as part of their future suddenly calculated it into their plans. The map of opportunity had been redrawn by gold, and the redrawn map ran through places far beyond the mining camps. This is one of the quiet but important transformations of 1849. The gold rush did not create just one road west. It created a network. The California Trail, Cape Horn, and Panama were different solutions to the same question. How could a person get from the world they knew to the gold fields of California? But together, they made California less isolated. They gave the Pacific coast new connections to the Atlantic seaboard, the Missouri River frontier, Central America, and the shipping lanes of the Pacific. That network changed how people understood the West. Before the rush, California could be imagined as remote, recently conquered, and only loosely attached to the rest of the United States. After Polk's confirmation and the migration that followed, it became a place toward which systems of movement bent themselves. Wagons, ships, ports, trails, and inland gateways all began to serve the same gravitational pull. The name Gold Mountain captures some of that pull. For Chinese migrants, California would be known as Saan or Gold Mountain, and Chinese arrivals began in 1849. That wider Pacific story will grow in importance as the rush expands beyond an American east-to-west migration. But even here, in the routes themselves, the outline is already visible. California was becoming a magnet for people from many directions. It was no longer merely the western edge of a continental story. It was becoming a meeting point of global movement. The routes also shaped what California would become when the migrants arrived. A miner traveling overland might arrive with limited supplies and urgent needs. A ship entering San Francisco Bay might carry passengers, tools, food, lumber, clothing, or goods intended for resale. A traveler crossing Panama might arrive through a chain of movement that depended on multiple ports and vessels. However they came, they brought demand with them. They needed places to sleep, eat, buy, sell, gamble, store goods, find news, and locate passage inland. That demand did not remain abstract. It landed in coastal towns and river gateways. It piled up on docks. It moved through storehouses and streets. It turned transportation into urban growth. The same routes that carried gold seekers toward the mines also carried the materials of boomtown life. This is why the route to California is not a side story. It is one of the ways the gold rush rewired the American West. The discovery at Coloma did not simply draw individuals toward a riverbank. It reorganized motion across land and sea. It made the California Trail a channel of mass migration. It made Atlantic ports part of a Pacific rush. It made Cape Horn and Panama part of the same story as Sutter's Mill. It turned distance into business, movement into infrastructure, and rumor into a system of travel. By the time the 49ers reached California, the rush had already done much of its work. It had connected the continent more tightly to the Pacific. It had made California present in the decisions of people thousands of miles away. And at the receiving end of those routes, one place in particular began to change with astonishing speed. Ships, passengers, goods, and hope converged on San Francisco, where a small port town was about to become one of the clearest signs that gold could transform far more than the mines. Those routes did not end at a line on a map. They ended in streets that could barely be called streets, on a crowded waterfront, beside ships that had carried passengers, tools, cloth, food, liquor, letters, and expectation toward California. By the time gold seekers arrived, San Francisco was no longer simply a place to pass through. It had become one of the first great visible consequences of the rush. Before the discovery at Coloma, San Francisco was a small port town. Its importance came from its harbor, not from its size. It sat at the edge of a vast bay, connected to the Pacific and, through the Pacific, to the wider world. That position mattered before gold, but gold changed the scale of everything. The port became a receiving station for human movement. Ships that had come around Cape Horn, vessels tied to the Panama route, and traffic moving along Pacific shipping lanes all pointed toward the same waterfront. The city became a place where the geography of the gold rush could be seen in one crowded frame. The National Park Service places San Francisco's population at about 25,000 by 1849. That estimate is important not only because it is large, it is important because of what it represents. The same year that about 25,000 migrants traveled on the California National Historic Trail, San Francisco itself was swelling into a boom city. The rush was not only filling mining camps in the Sierra foothills, it was creating an urban marketplace almost overnight. Gold seekers needed more than pans and hope. They needed beds, meals, storage, tools, credit, transport, information, and sometimes simply a place to wait. They needed merchants who could sell them supplies before they moved inland. They needed shipping agents, innkeepers, carpenters, cooks, laborers, and people willing to turn any available space into shelter. San Francisco grew because gold mining created needs before it created fortunes. Even a person who had not yet reached the diggings entered the gold economy the moment he tried to buy passage, lodging, equipment, or news. The city that rose in response was rough, temporary, and improvised. The research record describes San Francisco becoming a boom city of tent houses, hotels, stores, saloons, gambling halls, and shanties. That list tells us something about both urgency and uncertainty. Tent houses suggest speed. Shanties suggest scarcity and makeshift building. Hotels suggest people arriving faster than permanent homes could be built. Stores suggest the transformation of desire into commerce. Saloons and gambling halls suggest a city built around risk, not only in the mines, but in everyday life. A boom city is not just a city that grows. It is a city where growth outruns order. San Francisco's expansion came from pressure. People arrived before systems could fully absorb them. The waterfront, the streets, and the built environment became a record of sudden demand. Shelter could be temporary because no one knew how long the opportunity would last. Businesses could appear quickly because the incoming population was hungry for goods and services. The rush rewarded speed, and San Francisco's form reflected that. It was not planned into prosperity. It was pushed there by arrival after arrival. The transformation also shows why the gold rush cannot be understood only through the image of a miner at a stream. That image matters, but it is incomplete. The gold was in the foothills, but the money world around the gold reached much farther. San Francisco became a place where the rush was converted into trade. A man might come seeking ore from a riverbed, but before he touched a pan, he might pay for a meal, a room, a shovel, a drink, or a passage inland. Each transaction made the city more necessary. This is one reason merchants and suppliers could become central figures in the rush. Mining was uncertain. A claim might fail. A river bar might disappoint. A journey into the interior might end with exhaustion, illness, or debt. But every newcomer needed provisions. In that sense, San Francisco did not merely serve the gold rush. It interpreted the gold rush as a business opportunity. Its stores and hotels were not side details. They were part of the machinery that made mass migration possible. The city's rise also reveals how quickly California was pulled into wider systems. Earlier, the rush had connected Atlantic ports, Cape Horn, Panama, wagon roads, and Pacific shipping. San Francisco was where those systems became crowded and visible. Goods that began far away arrived there because buyers were expected. People who had crossed oceans or the continent found themselves in the same port, carrying different experiences but responding to the same promise. The harbor made San Francisco a hinge between global movement and inland extraction. That hinge mattered because California was still being remade politically and socially in the wake of conquest. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had transferred California from Mexico to the United States in 1848, just days after Marshall's discovery. By 1849, San Francisco's growth was demonstrating what that transfer could mean on the ground. A small port in a recently acquired province was being transformed into a city serving a population surge of continental and global significance. The political map had changed by treaty. The urban map was changing by gold. And yet, the city's energy should not be mistaken for stability. Tents, shanties, saloons, and gambling halls speak to a world in motion. Many arrivals did not intend to settle permanently in San Francisco. They treated it as a threshold. They came ashore, gathered supplies, listened for news, and looked toward the interior. But a threshold can become powerful. The more people passed through, the more services were required. The more services appeared, the more the city drew still more traffic. San Francisco grew because it was both a destination and a departure point. The built landscape would have felt provisional, but the consequences were lasting. A tent house might stand for only a short time, but the need behind it helped define the city's future. A store might begin as a speculative venture, but it marked the rise of a commercial center. A hotel might be crowded and uncomfortable, but it showed that strangers were arriving in numbers large enough to make hospitality into an industry. A gambling hall might seem like an emblem of disorder, but it also captured the spirit of the economy around it, men staking money, time, bodies, and futures on the chance that fortune could be seized quickly. The National Park Service estimate of about 25,000 people by 1849 gives scale to that atmosphere. It reminds us that San Francisco's boom was not a slow generational process. It was compressed into the first great year of migration. The same force that sent wagons over the California Trail and ships around Cape Horn was remaking the port's daily life. In a very short span, the town became proof that gold could create urban growth at a distance from the mines themselves. That proof matters to the larger story. The gold rush rewired the American West, not only by moving people into the Sierra foothills, but by creating new centers of supply, exchange, and decision. San Francisco became a Pacific-facing city of arrival, speculation, and commerce. It gathered the roots of the rush into one place and then redirected them inland. The harbor received the world. The streets sorted it into buyers, sellers, gamblers, laborers, travelers, and would-be miners. From there, ambition did not stop at the waterfront. It moved upriver and overland toward the interior, toward the Sacramento Valley, toward the world of Sutter's Fort and New Helvetia, and toward the roads and river corridors leading into mining country. San Francisco showed that gold could build a boom city on the coast. But the rush was also remaking the inland gateway, where supplies, people, and hopes turned toward the Sierra foothills. San Francisco gathered the rush at the edge of the Pacific, but it could not hold it there. The harbor was a beginning, not an end. Gold seekers who stepped off ships still had to move inland, away from the crowded waterfront and toward the rivers and foothills where the discovery had first been made. Goods had to follow them. Tools, food, clothing, liquor, tents, letters, rumors, and credit all had to be pushed toward mining country. In that movement, the gold rush transformed another kind of place, not a port facing the ocean, but an inland gateway facing the Sierra Nevada. That gateway was tied to John A. Sutter's world of Sutter's Fort and New Helvetia. Before the rush became a national migration, before President James K. Polk's confirmation helped turn rumor into certainty, Sutter had been trying to build an agricultural and commercial settlement in California's interior. His home base was not at the sawmill where gold was found. The mill at Coloma was being built roughly 40 miles away, on the South Fork of the American River, because Sutter's larger project needed lumber, infrastructure, and usable materials. The discovery that changed California came out of that ordinary need: a work site, a mill race, a carpenter and sawmill operator named James W. Marshall, and a tail race carrying water away from the mechanism of the mill. The irony was sharp. Sutter's settlement plans required order, labor, and supply. The gold rush brought movement, abandonment, and competition. A place meant to anchor an interior colony became connected to one of the most unstable migrations in American history. The fort and the settlement around it were no longer simply Sutter's domain. They were pulled into a widening system of transit and exchange as thousands of people began moving from the coast toward the gold-bearing foothills. Sacramento mattered because geography mattered. The gold was not discovered in San Francisco. It was not found at the edge of the bay, where ships could drop anchor and unload passengers directly into the diggings. It was found inland, in the foothill country around Coloma, in the valley known to the Nisenan as Colima, meaning a beautiful valley. The discovery site, now preserved as Marshall Gold Discovery State Historic Park in El Dorado County, sat along the South Fork of the American River. To reach such places, migrants had to pass through interior routes, river corridors, and supply centers. They needed gateways between arrival and extraction. San Francisco was the great receiving point, but Sacramento became part of the machinery that turned arrival into mining. The rush was not simply a line of people walking toward streams with pans. It required staging. A miner needed something to eat before he reached the diggings. He needed equipment before he could work a claim. He needed information, however unreliable, about which creeks were crowded, which bars were promising, which roads were passable, and where prices were rising. Merchants needed access to those miners. Teamsters and boatmen needed cargo. Speculators needed land, buildings, or a rumor of future growth. The closer a settlement stood to the roots into the foothills, the more it could become a hinge in the gold economy. That is why the inland story changes the meaning of the gold rush. If we look only at the mines, the rush can appear as a scramble for flakes and nuggets. If we look only at San Francisco, it can appear as a story of ships, saloons, gambling halls, hotels, stores, tent houses, and shanties. But the interior shows something broader. The rush created a chain of dependence. Ships brought people and goods to the Pacific coast. From there, routes carried them inland. Inland settlements directed them toward mining country. Mining camps then demanded still more supplies, more labor, more transport, and more capital. Each link strengthened the next. Sutter's fort stood near the center of that shift from settlement project to gateway economy. It had been associated with New Helvetia, Sutter's attempt to create his own base in California's interior. But after January 24, 1848, the meaning of that interior changed. Marshall's discovery did not merely enrich a private enterprise. In fact, it disrupted the world that had made the mill possible. Labor that might have gone into farming, building, and maintaining Sutter's operations could be drawn away by the hope of gold. The authority of landholders and entrepreneurs was tested by a rush of people who came with their own ambitions and their own urgency. The movement inland also made clear that the gold rush was a transportation event as much as a mining event. Earlier routes had brought migrants toward California by wagon road, by the long voyage around Cape Horn, or by the combined sea and land crossing through the Isthmus of Panama. But reaching California did not solve the problem of distance. It only changed its scale. The final miles between port, valley, river, and foothill could decide who arrived early, who paid high prices, who lost supplies, and who found themselves stranded between expectation and reality. Every shovel, pan, blanket, barrel, crate, and sack had to be moved through this interior geography. That made supply itself a form of power. A person might come to California dreaming of discovery, but the merchant who sold tools, the carrier who moved goods, and the town that stood along the route could profit whether a miner struck gold or not. This was one of the quiet transformations of the rush. It rewarded not only those who found metal in the stream beds, but those who positioned themselves along the pathways to hope. Sacramento's rise as an inland gateway also connected the gold rush to the older layers of California's history. This was not empty land suddenly activated by American ambition. The road to the mines passed through a region already shaped by native homelands, Mexican-era California, and the ambitions of settlers like Sutter. The discovery at Coloma occurred in Nizanan country. The valley remembered as Coloma was not a blank stage for newcomers. It was an indigenous homeland before it became a symbol of expansion. The rush pushed through that world with extraordinary force, and the routes that carried supplies and migrants toward the Sierra foothills also carried dispossession, disruption, and violence. For the people pouring in, however, the interior often appeared through the language of opportunity. The foothills promised gold. The rivers promised access. The fort, the valley, and the emerging supply points promised orientation in a landscape many newcomers barely understood. A gold seeker arriving from an Atlantic port, from the overland trail, or from a Pacific crossing needed more than courage. He needed a way to translate a distant rumor into a practical journey, where to go, what to buy, whom to trust, and how to reach the diggings before someone else did. The gold rush, therefore, rewired the West by changing the purpose of places. San Francisco became more than a harbor. Sacramento became more than an inland settlement. Sutter's fort became more than the center of one man's planned domain. Coloma became more than a worksite for a sawmill. The South Fork of the American River became more than a river channel. Each place was assigned a new role in a system driven by migration and extraction. This system moved with astonishing speed because it fed on expectation. People did not wait for perfect maps or stable institutions. They moved because official confirmation had made the gold credible, because other people were moving, and because delay seemed dangerous. A man who hesitated in the east might imagine another man already digging in his place. A merchant who waited too long might imagine competitors already selling supplies at the edge of the mines. A settlement that positioned itself along the inland routes could become valuable almost overnight. That kind of rapid change carried political consequences. The rush was no longer just a discovery, or even a migration. It was producing towns, routes, commercial centers, and a population demanding order, authority, and recognition. California had been transferred from Mexico to the United States through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Almost immediately, gold made the new possession impossible to treat as distant or marginal. The interior gateways, the boom cities, and the mining districts were all signs of the same transformation. California was being pulled quickly into the structures of American power. In the movement from San Francisco to Sacramento, from Sutter's Fort to Coloma, from supply corridors to the Sierra foothills, the gold rush became a map of acceleration. It compressed time. It turned remote places into strategic places. It made the inland valley part of a global movement of people and goods. And as the population surged, the question became larger than who would find gold. The question was what California itself would become. By 1849, as the word Eureka appeared on the state seal and the push for political organization gained force, the rush was already carrying California toward a new status in the Union. The rush had already turned movement into pressure. People moved from ships to streets, from river landings to roads, from Sacramento toward the foothills. Supplies followed them. News followed them. Claims, arguments, prices, rumors, and expectations followed them. What had begun as a discovery in a mill channel was no longer only a search for metal. It was becoming a demand for political form. By 1849, California was changing faster than the institutions around it could absorb. The United States had only recently acquired the region from Mexico through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848. That treaty belonged to the world of diplomacy and war. The gold rush belonged to the world of movement, labor, and sudden population. Together, they made California an urgent question for the nation. This is one of the quiet but decisive turns in the gold rush story. Gold did not simply attract miners. It accelerated incorporation. It made a far western possession difficult to leave undefined. California State Parks states that the gold rush hastened California's admission to the Union on September 9, 1850. That sentence holds a great deal of history. It means that the rush did not only reshape rivers, trails, cities, and markets. It helped alter the political timetable of the United States. Before gold, California could be imagined from Washington as distant, newly acquired, and still being brought into the orbit of American rule. After gold, distance remained real, but it no longer meant delay. Ships were arriving. Overland migrants were crossing the continent. San Francisco had become a boom city. Sacramento was becoming an inland gateway. The Sierra foothills were filling with seekers. The question was no longer whether California mattered. The question was how quickly the United States would give political shape to a place already being transformed on the ground. The speed mattered because California stood at the meeting point of several American turning points. It had been part of Mexico. It was home to native nations, Spanish-speaking Californios, Mexican-era settlements, missions, ranchos, and military occupation before statehood. It was now the site of a gold discovery that drew thousands from the eastern United States and beyond. It sat between the Mexican-American War and the Compromise of 1850, at a moment when Western expansion intensified national debates over free and slave territory. Gold gave those debates a sharper edge. It made California more than a line on a treaty map. It made California a place whose population, wealth, and strategic importance were increasing rapidly. A mineral discovery in the foothills had forced a national question. How would this Pacific Coast society be organized within the Union? The answer came with unusual speed. California was admitted as a state on September 9, 1850. In the longer rhythm of United States expansion, that was a remarkable acceleration. The discovery had occurred on January 24, 1848. The treaty transferring California from Mexico to the United States had been signed on February 2nd of that same year. President James K. Polk had confirmed the reports of California gold to Congress on December 5, 1848. By spring 1849, the migration of the 49ers was underway. And by September 9, 1850, California had entered the Union. That sequence shows how compressed the moment was. A sawmill project in Coloma, the Tailrace on the South Fork of the American River, the spread of rumor, presidential confirmation, migration across land and sea, the growth of San Francisco and Sacramento, and the statehood decision all unfolded in a narrow span of time. The gold rush made California seem to move politically at the speed of a boomtown. Symbols moved quickly, too. In 1849, as California sought statehood, the Greek word Eureka appeared on California's state seal. The word means, "I have found it." In one sense, the phrase was perfectly suited to the gold country. It captured the cry every prospector hoped to make. It turned the instant of discovery into a civic motto. A person finds a flake in a pan, a glitter in gravel, a sign that the long journey may have been worth the risk. Eureka gave that feeling a classical form, but on the seal, the word did more than celebrate mining luck. It helped translate a rush of people and ambition into the language of public identity. California was presenting itself not merely as a mining camp, not merely as a conquered province, and not merely as a distant Western possession. It was asserting a claim to political existence. "I have found it" could refer to gold, but it also suggested arrival, recognition, and destiny. California had found wealth. Migrants had found a destination. The United States had found a Pacific prize. And the emerging state was trying to define what it had become. The power of the word lies in that double meaning. Eureka speaks from the miner's hand, but it also speaks from the seal of a government. It links private discovery to public authority. The glitter in the tailrace becomes a sign on an official emblem. A scattered rush becomes a state-making force. This transformation was not neutral. To become a state was to enter the structures of American law, politics, and expansion. It meant California would not remain an undefined frontier space in federal hands for long. It meant the consequences of the rush would be organized through courts, offices, property claims, elections, and official power. It also meant that the rapid political incorporation of California was built on a landscape where many communities already existed before the rush began. That is why statehood cannot be treated only as an achievement of speed. It was also an act of consolidation. The gold rush brought a population surge and new institutions, but it did so in a region already inhabited and governed in other ways before the United States took control. Native Californians, Californios, and earlier communities did not vanish because a new seal carried the word Eureka. Their presence is part of the deeper story beneath the political milestone. Still, the date itself remains central. September 9, 1850 marks the moment when California entered the Union, and the gold rush helps explain why that happened so quickly. Gold created a sense of urgency, powerful enough to pull the Pacific coast into the nation's political center. It changed how Americans thought about distance. A place that had seemed remote became immediate. A region newly transferred through treaty became a state. A discovery in a work channel helped speed the making of a new American political reality. This is one reason the gold rush belongs among American turning points. It did not simply reward some miners and disappoint many others. It changed the pace of national expansion. It helped connect the Pacific coast to debates in Washington, to ships out of Atlantic ports, to overland trails, to supply towns, to river corridors, and to the ambitions of people who believed California had become the place where futures could be remade. The state seal's Eureka fixed that confidence in a single word. It suggested certainty in a moment that was actually full of uncertainty. The mines were uncertain. Journeys were uncertain. Claims were uncertain. Prices, health, law, and survival were uncertain. Yet the seal spoke as if discovery itself had supplied an answer. "I have found it." The phrase gave the rush a public voice. But what had been found was not only gold. California had been found by the world's shipping routes, by overland migration, by federal politics, by merchants and laborers, by speculators and miners, by people crossing oceans and continents. The rush that helped carry California into the Union was already reaching far beyond the eastern United States. Its center was in the Sierra foothills, but its pull extended across the Pacific, across Latin America, across Europe, across Australia, and into countless lives drawn toward the promise of Gold Mountain. California's new statehood gave the rush a political shape, but it did not contain it. A state line could be drawn on paper. A seal could carry the word Eureka. A government could claim authority, but the movement toward gold had already escaped any narrow national frame. The Sierra foothills were becoming a meeting ground for people whose journeys began far beyond the eastern United States, far beyond Missouri River trailheads, and far beyond the Atlantic cities that sent ships around Cape Horn. The gold rush is often told as an American east-to-west migration, and part of it was exactly that. The name 49ers still carries the image of wagons, overland trails, and people leaving farms, towns, and cities in the older United States. But that image is incomplete. California in the late 1840s and early 1850s was not only the endpoint of continental expansion. It was a magnet in a wider world of ports, oceans, labor markets, and rumor. Gold did not merely pull Americans west. It pulled people into motion across the Pacific, across Latin America, across Europe, and from places as distant as Australia. That wider movement changed what California was part. Before the rush, it had been a recently conquered Mexican province, a place with native nations, Spanish-speaking Californios, Mexican-era settlements, missions, ranchos, and the military and political uncertainty that followed war. After the discovery, it became a destination known across shipping routes and commercial networks. The question was no longer only how the United States would reach California. The question was how much of the world would. The routes themselves tell the story. Some gold seekers crossed the continent overland on the California Trail, joining the long and dangerous passage toward the Pacific. Others left from Atlantic ports by sea, sailing around Cape Horn at the southern end of South America before turning north along the Pacific coast. Still others used a combined sea and land route, sailing to Panama, crossing the Isthmus of Panama, and then boarding another vessel for California. These were not only American pathways. They were corridors of global movement. They tied California to Atlantic ports, Pacific shipping lanes, Latin American crossings, and the commercial geography of the wider ocean world. The Panama route made the global nature of the rush especially visible. It turned a thin strip of land between oceans into part of California's story. Passengers who chose that path were not simply going west in a straight line. They were moving through an interoceanic system, one that connected the eastern seaboard of the United States to the Caribbean, the Isthmus, and the Pacific. Their destination was the same as that of overland migrants, but their experience belonged to a different map. Ships, harbors, transfers, waiting, crowding, uncertainty, and the constant pressure of time. The voyage around Cape Horn also stretched the gold rush across the map. It made California part of a maritime world in which distance was measured not only in miles, but in months, weather, wind, and endurance. A person leaving from an Atlantic port and rounding the southern tip of South America was not simply migrating to a mining district. That traveler was entering a global circuit of risk and supply. The ships carried people, but also goods, tools, clothing, food, liquor, building materials, and the things that made boomtowns possible. By the time those ships reached San Francisco, the rush had already become more than a search for metal in gravel. It had become a commercial system. That system drew migrants from Latin America. For people in the Spanish-speaking world, California was not an unknown abstraction. It had been part of Mexico until the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo transferred it to the United States in 1848, just days after James W. Marshall's discovery at Sutter's sawmill. The gold rush therefore unfolded across a border that had only recently changed. Spanish-speaking Californios already lived in the region. Migrants from Latin America moved toward a gold economy that was close in geography, language, and history, even as United States power was rapidly reorganizing the place around them. This matters because the gold rush did not begin in an empty American West. It erupted in a layered California. Native homelands, Mexican landholding, military occupation, merchant ambition, and incoming migration all overlapped. For Latin American migrants, the rush was not simply a journey to a foreign frontier. It was movement into a region whose political ownership had just shifted, but whose older connections to Mexico, the Pacific coast, and Spanish-speaking America had not disappeared overnight. Migrants also came from Europe. For them, California represented a different kind of horizon, not a neighboring territory, but a faraway chance carried by letters, newspapers, shipping news, commercial agents, and rumor. Polk's confirmation of gold to Congress in December 1848 helped turn scattered reports into credible political fact in the United States, but the news did not remain inside the United States. Gold was the kind of discovery that traveled easily. It needed little translation. The meaning was blunt and portable. A place had been found where ordinary people might imagine sudden wealth. That promise was powerful, even when the reality was harsh. The mines were uncertain. Claims could be contested. Prices were high. Disease, exhaustion, violence, and disappointment followed many who came. But the uncertainty did not weaken the pull. In some ways, it strengthened it. Gold created a rare kind of migration, one built on the possibility that a person might arrive late and still be transformed. That possibility turned California into a world destination. Australia also belonged to that widening geography. Its inclusion reminds us that the gold rush was a Pacific event, not merely an American one. The Pacific Ocean did not separate California from the rest of the world as much as it connected it. Ships could make the coast accessible to people whose points of departure were not New York, Boston, or Missouri, but other shorelines entirely. The same ocean that made California seem remote from Washington made it reachable from places across the Pacific world. In this sense, San Francisco was not only a boom city, it was a receiving station for global motion. Its tents, hotels, stores, saloons, gambling halls, and shanties were built not just for miners from the eastern United States, but for a mixed population constantly arriving, leaving, buying, selling, searching, and improvising. The city's growth by 1849, placed by the National Park Service at about 25,000 people, showed how quickly a small port could become an international threshold. People came through it with different languages, currencies, skills, expectations, and vulnerabilities. Sacramento and the inland routes turned that same global movement toward the foothills. Goods moved from ships to rivercraft, from landings to roads, from merchants to miners. The rush created a chain of dependence. A miner in the Sierra foothills needed tools, food, clothing, shelter, and information. A merchant on the coast needed ships. A ship needed ports, crews, cargo, and customers. The gold economy was therefore not confined to the creek bed or claim. It stretched backward through every route that brought people and material to California. This is one of the central transformations of the gold rush. It made California a place that the world had to calculate around. Before the discovery, it could be imagined by many outsiders as distant, peripheral, or difficult to reach. After the discovery, distance itself became something to overcome. Routes were chosen, risks were compared, departures were planned, and lives were rearranged. California became not the far edge of someone else's map, but the point toward which maps were being redrawn. The global character of the rush also sharpened conflict. A sudden population surge brought competition over claims, labor, space, law, and belonging. California's admission to the Union did not resolve those tensions. Statehood supplied a political framework, but the goldfields remained crowded with people whose presence raised questions about rights, citizenship, race, language, and power. The same force that made California a magnet also made it a place of exclusion and contest. And beneath all of this, native Californians bore the heaviest consequences. The global rush moved into homelands that were already inhabited and sustained by older systems of land, water, food, and community. The arrival of miners from many parts of the world did not soften the invasion, it intensified the pressure. The rush redirected waterways, consumed resources, and helped unleash violence and displacement. To call the gold rush global is not to make it grander or cleaner. It is to understand the scale of the force that descended on California. By the early 1850s, the words used for California began to reveal the reach of that force. For Chinese migrants, California became Saan, Gold Mountain. The name carried hope, distance, danger, and imagination all at once. Chinese arrivals began in 1849, and within only a few years, the scale of the movement would become one of the clearest signs that the California gold rush belonged to the Pacific world. The magnet was no longer only pulling from the American East. It was drawing men across an ocean toward a mountain of promise and toward a California that would never again be only a distant frontier. By the early 1850s, California had many names layered over the same landscape. To some, it was the new American state rushed into the Union. To others, it was the place of Eureka, the place where "I have found it" became a public motto. To merchants, it was a market. To miners, it was a gamble. And for Chinese migrants looking across the Pacific, it became Saan, Gold Mountain. The name did not describe a single hill or a single mine. It described a promise. California was imagined as a place where gold could change the course of a life, and perhaps the fortunes of a family far away. That imagination mattered. The gold rush did not move people only through maps and contracts. It moved through letters, rumors, translated stories, port conversations, and the widening knowledge that something extraordinary had happened on the far side of the ocean. Chinese immigrants began arriving in California in 1849. That date places them at the beginning of the rush, not at its margins. They were part of the first great surge that turned the discovery at Coloma into a global event. The earlier chapters followed the overland roads, the harbor of San Francisco, the inland gateway of Sacramento, and the political acceleration toward statehood. But Saan asks us to turn the map another way. It asks us to see California from across the Pacific. From that angle, the gold rush was not simply a story of Americans moving west. It was a Pacific world migration. Ships, ports, and ocean routes mattered as much as wagon roads and mountain passes. California's coast faced outward. San Francisco Bay was not only an arrival point for travelers from Atlantic routes or from the Isthmus of Panama. It was also part of a wider ocean system that connected California to Asia, Latin America, Australia, and other parts of the world already drawn into the gold economy. The Smithsonian National Museum of American History gives one measure of the scale. It states that some 20,000 male immigrants arrived from China in 1852 alone. That number is striking because it belongs to a single year. It shows how quickly Saan became more than a phrase. It became a route, a decision, a risk, and a mass movement. The wording matters too. The Smithsonian identifies these arrivals as male immigrants. Like many gold rush migrations, this movement was shaped by labor, danger, distance, and the expectation that young men would travel first. They crossed an ocean toward a mining world that was unstable, crowded, and often hostile. They arrived in a California still being remade almost faster than institutions could respond. Statehood had come in 1850, but the social order of the gold country was still forming in camps, claims, ports, streets, and supply routes. By 1852, the rush had already passed beyond its first explosive season. The 49ers had given the migration its most famous nickname, but the movement did not end with them. The goldfields continued to draw people because the idea of opportunity remained powerful even as the easiest discoveries became harder to find. Chinese migrants entered this world at a moment when the gold rush was becoming more complex, more competitive, and more deeply connected to capital, labor, and exclusion. The basic engine was still the same. Gold had made California valuable in the eyes of the world. But the social reality was changing. A prospector with a pan was only one figure in a much larger system. There were merchants selling tools, shippers carrying passengers, port cities handling goods, river landings connecting the coast to the interior, and inland towns feeding the movement toward the Sierra foothills. Chinese immigrants became part of this system not as an afterthought, but as one of the clearest signs that California's transformation had reached across the Pacific. Saan carried hope, but hope was never simple. The phrase Gold Mountain suggested abundance, yet the journey itself required leaving home for a place many migrants knew through incomplete information. The mountain was real and imagined at the same time. Real, because gold had been found in the rivers and gravels of the Sierra foothills. Imagined, because the name compressed all the uncertainty of California into one shining symbol. That is part of the power of the gold rush as a turning point. It created images strong enough to reorder lives. Marshall's find in the Tailrace at Sutter's sawmill was a small physical event, flakes of gold in a work channel beside the South Fork of the American River. But once confirmed, circulated, and believed, it became a force that could reach villages, ports, families, and labor networks far from California. Saan was one expression of that force. The scale of Chinese migration also changes the way we understand California itself. If the gold rush had been only an American east-to-west migration, California might appear as the final edge of the nation, a far western destination. But the arrival of Chinese immigrants shows that California was also an ocean-facing place. It was not merely the end of a continental trail. It was a hinge between the United States and the Pacific. This helps explain why the rush rewired the West rather than simply filling it. Rewiring means new connections, new routes, new pressures, and new consequences. California was tied to Atlantic cities through Cape Horn and Panama routes, to Missouri River departure points through overland migration, and to Pacific crossings through the movement of people from across the ocean. The discovery made these connections urgent. It turned distance into something people would measure against possible gain. For Chinese migrants, the distance was enormous, but the pull was strong enough to make the crossing worth attempting. The Smithsonian's figure of some 20,000 male immigrants from China in 1852 alone captures the intensity of that pull. It also suggests the stakes. People did not move in such numbers because a rumor was faint. They moved because the rumor had hardened into expectation, because California had become legible as a place where labor might be converted into wealth. Still, to describe the movement only as aspiration would flatten the story. Gold Rush California was not an open field of equal chances. It was a place of competition over land, water, claims, labor, and belonging. The same global rush that drew migrants together also sharpened conflicts among them. The mining districts and boomtowns were crowded with people trying to turn unstable conditions to their advantage. Every new arrival increased the pressure on the landscape and on the communities already there. That pressure is essential to remember. Saan reveals the reach of the gold rush, but reach is not the same as innocence. The global migration that brought Chinese men to California also intensified the transformation of native homelands into mining country. More people meant more demand for food, wood, water, roots, and claims. More mining meant more disturbance of rivers and soils. More settlements meant more intrusion into places that had not been empty before the rush began. The story of Chinese immigration therefore belongs within two truths at once. It is a story of movement, courage, and the Pacific dimensions of California's gold economy. It is also part of a larger upheaval that placed enormous pressure on the land and on native communities. Saan shows how far the dream traveled. It also shows how many lives were drawn into the consequences of one discovery. By 1852, California was no longer just a place where gold had been found. It was a destination known across oceans, a state pulled into the United States with unusual speed, a market connected to global routes, and a contested landscape where thousands arrived, seeking futures that the goldfields could not guarantee. The name Gold Mountain preserved the brightness of the promise. But beneath that brightness, the rush was grinding through rivers, villages, food sources, and homelands. To follow the force of Saan honestly, the story must also turn toward those who did not come seeking California, but were already there when the world descended. The brightness of Gold Mountain depended on where a person stood. For migrants crossing oceans, California could appear as a place of possibility, a landscape remade by rumor, labor, and risk. But for the native peoples whose homelands were already there, the same movement looked very different. It was not a journey toward opportunity. It was an invasion into lived places, into villages, rivers, food systems, burial grounds, and names that long predated the word Eureka. This is the part of the gold rush that cannot be held at the edge of the story. The discovery at Coloma did not simply draw people toward California. It brought a sudden, violent pressure onto native California. The same routes that carried miners, merchants, tools, and supplies also carried dispossession. The same rivers that were read by newcomers as channels of gold were already part of native homelands and food worlds. The same foothills that became mining country were not empty ground waiting for history to begin. At the center of this episode's beginning was Coloma, the beautiful valley known to the Nisenan. That place became famous to the outside world because James W. Marshall found gold in the Tailrace at Sutter's sawmill on January 24, 1848. But before it was fixed in national memory as the place of discovery, it was part of a native homeland. Marshall Gold Discovery State Historic Park now preserves the discovery site in El Dorado County, and that preservation holds a difficult layering. The site remembers the beginning of a rush, while also standing on land where the rush helped bring catastrophe. The Smithsonian National Museum of American History describes the gold rush's damage to native communities in direct terms. Indian villages were destroyed. Waterways were redirected. Food supplies were depleted. Native cultures were profoundly affected. Among them were the Nisenan, whose world around the South Fork of the American River was struck by the rush with devastating force. The museum describes the near destruction of the Nisenan among the native cultures affected by the gold rush. Those words matter because they shift the story away from the familiar image of individual prospectors bending over pans in a river. The damage was not only a series of isolated conflicts, it was structural. When villages were destroyed, people lost homes, stored food, social centers, and places of memory. When waterways were redirected, the injury moved through the land itself. A river and mining country was not just scenery and not just a working channel for gold. It was a source of fish, plants, drinking water, travel, and seasonal rhythm. To alter a waterway was to alter the conditions of survival. The depletion of food supplies had the same widening effect. The gold rush brought an enormous influx of people into regions where native communities already had established relationships with the land. Miners and settlers consumed local resources, occupied gathering areas, disrupted animal habitat, and transformed riverbanks into work sites. In the rush economy, food became something to buy, ship, store, and sell to newcomers. For native communities, food systems were tied to place, season, access, and knowledge. When those systems were broken, hunger followed the violence. The tragedy of the Nisenan brings the larger pattern into one sharply focused place. The earliest chapters of this story return to Coloma because the discovery happened there. But the same fact must now be read differently. The place that became a symbol of American expansion was also a place where native life was nearly destroyed. The milled tailrace has often been treated as a point of origin, a narrow channel where a few flakes of metal changed the future. For the Nisenan, the origin of the gold rush was not a clean beginning. It was the start of a cascade that moved through villages, waterways, and food sources. This does not mean that every newcomer experienced California in the same way or held the same amount of power. Earlier chapters followed migrants from the eastern United States, Latin America, China, Europe, Australia, and other places. Many arrived poor, hopeful, indebted, or desperate. Many were themselves vulnerable to exploitation and exclusion. But the gold rush, as a historical force, still pressed most heavily on those who had not chosen to enter it at all. Native Californians did not set out for Gold Mountain. Gold Mountain came to them. The Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian frames the Gold Rush era as central to understanding whether United States actions against California Native Americans meet the United Nations definition of genocide. That framing is stark, and it asks the audience to hold the gold rush within a legal and moral vocabulary larger than migration, mining, or statehood. The point is not to use the word casually. It is to recognize that the events of this era are essential evidence in the question of whether what happened to California Native Americans fits an international definition created to describe attempts to destroy a people. Placed in that frame, the gold rush becomes more than a turning point in American expansion. It becomes a test of how the national story is told. If the rush is narrated only through discovery, daring journeys, boomtowns, and statehood, then the people most violently affected are made to disappear a second time. The documentary record asks for something else. It asks that destroyed villages, redirected waterways, depleted food supplies, and the near destruction of the Nisenan be treated as central, not incidental. This also changes how we understand the speed of California's transformation. California entered the Union on September 9, 1850, only a short time after gold was found at Coloma. That speed has often been presented as evidence of energy and ambition. But the acceleration of statehood also meant that native communities were caught in a rapidly hardening political order. The land was being claimed, mined, governed, bought, sold, and imagined as American at the very moment when native peoples were being pushed from the conditions that sustained them. The contradiction is deep. The United States had only just acquired California through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848. Within days of Marshall's discovery, the political ownership of California was shifting at the level of empires and treaties. But native nations were not simply waiting inside that transfer as passive subjects. Their homelands were being absorbed into a new American map, while miners on the ground were remaking rivers, camps, and valleys in pursuit of gold. The force of the rush worked from above and below at once: federal expansion and local invasion, national ambition and daily destruction. The physical processes of mining made the catastrophe more severe. Even in the early rush, the search for gold depended on water, gravel, timber, movement, and occupation. A mining camp required supplies. A claim required space. A profitable riverbank attracted more people. Trails thickened. Settlements formed. Merchants arrived. Animals grazed. Trees were cut. Streams were worked and reworked. None of this happened in a vacuum. Every act that turned native land into mining country narrowed native access to the places that had sustained life before the rush. To say that waterways were redirected is to describe a technical act with human consequences. Water could be moved to wash sediment, feed mining systems, or support new settlements. But when water was diverted, the surrounding world changed. A redirected stream could mean a damaged fishery, a changed plant environment, or a place no longer usable in the way it had been used before. In the gold rush, environmental change and social violence were not separate stories. They reinforced each other. The same is true of food. Depleted food supplies were not merely a side effect of population growth. They were part of the mechanism by which native communities were made vulnerable. If people could not safely remain in their villages, if they could not rely on familiar waterways, if the resources around them were consumed or destroyed, then displacement became a condition of survival. The gold rush rewired the West not only by linking California to global routes, ports, and markets, but by severing native communities from the land-based systems that made their worlds possible. There is a quiet danger in the phrase gold rush. It can make the event sound almost natural, like water moving downhill, as if people simply flowed toward a discovery. But rushing is also a force that tramples what is in its path. In California, the path ran through native homelands. The promise that pulled miners toward the Sierra foothills became catastrophe for communities already rooted there. By returning to Coloma, the story closes a circle and opens another. The beautiful valley was never only the place where gold entered American politics and global imagination. It was also a place where the cost of that transformation became immediate and intimate. The South Fork of the American River carried more than the memory of discovery. It carried the consequences of a world suddenly reorganized around extraction. And extraction did not remain small. The early image of a miner with a pan would soon give way to systems that demanded more water, more equipment, more capital, and more control over the land itself. The destruction of villages and food sources belongs to the human catastrophe of the rush, but it also points toward the next stage of the mining economy. Once gold was treated as something that justified remaking rivers and landscapes, the methods would grow larger. The rush that had already devastated native communities was becoming an industrial transformation of land, labor, and water. The movement from village destruction and food source collapse to industrial mining was not a separate story. It was part of the same transformation. Once miners treated rivers, banks, gravel bars, and hillsides as raw material for extraction, the scale of the gold rush began to change. The familiar image of a solitary miner kneeling beside a stream with a pan captures only the earliest and simplest form of the search. It does not capture what the rush became when the easiest gold was no longer enough. At first, placer mining seemed to fit the promise that had drawn so many people west. Placer gold was gold that had already been freed from rock by erosion and carried into streams and river gravels. A miner with a pan could scoop sediment from a bar or shallow channel, swirl water through it, and hope that heavier flakes or grains of gold would settle at the bottom. The method was simple, portable, and deeply tied to the first mythology of the gold rush. One person, one tool, one chance at sudden wealth. But that mythology had limits. Panning was slow. It worked best where gold was near the surface and easy to separate from sand and gravel. In the earliest rush, when newcomers crowded into the Sierra foothills and riverbeds, those accessible places were quickly searched and researched. The very success of the rush made individual methods less effective. More miners arrived. More claims were worked. More gravel had to be moved to find smaller returns. The problem was no longer simply finding gold. It was moving enough earth and water to make the search profitable. That pressure pushed miners toward sluices. A sluice was a practical step between the pan and the mine as an industrial system. Instead of washing a small amount of sediment by hand, miners could send larger quantities of water and gravel through a constructed channel. The flow of water did part of the work. The heavier gold could be trapped while lighter material washed away. The principle was still placer mining, still dependent on gold-bearing sediment and moving water, but the scale had changed. Mining was becoming less about the gesture of a single person and more about an arrangement of lumber, water, labor, and location. This is one of the quiet turning points in the gold rush. The technology did not have to look dramatic to change the social order of mining. A sluice required coordination. It required materials. It required control over water and access to a claim that could feed the system. It favored those who could build, organize, defend, and sometimes expand beyond what an individual pan could do. The rush was shifting from improvisation toward infrastructure, From there, the logic of enlargement continued. If water in a sluice could wash gravel through a channel, then high-pressure water could be used to attack the gravel itself. Hydraulic mining took that idea to a far more destructive scale. It used powerful streams of water to wash away gold-bearing gravel, turning hillsides and ancient deposits into slurry that could be processed for gold. The technique made water into a cutting tool. It transformed the landscape from something miners searched into something they dismantled. Hydraulic mining revealed how far the gold rush had moved from the early scenes at river edges. The miner with a pan had worked within the shape of a stream. Hydraulic mining sought to remake that shape. It required water systems, equipment, labor, and capital. It required the ability to direct water with enough force to break apart earth. It also required confidence that the landscape could be reorganized in the service of extraction. The consequences of that confidence were immense. In California's northern Sierra Nevada, hydraulic mining from the 1850s to the 1880s processed more than 1.5 billion cubic yards of gold-bearing placer gravel, according to the United States Geological Survey. That number belongs to the environmental story that follows, but it also tells us something essential about the industrial character of the rush. This was not simply a crowd of fortune seekers bending over streams. It was an expanding system capable of moving land in quantities that are difficult to imagine. Gold extraction had become earth-moving. At the same time, not all gold could be reached through loose gravel. Some remained locked in rock. Hard rock mining marked another major shift. Instead of working only the gold that water and erosion had already carried into stream beds, miners and companies pursued veins within solid formations. That meant another kind of mining economy: tunnels, shafts, equipment, and sustained labor. The search moved underground and into the mountain itself. Hard rock mining made the capital requirements even clearer. A pan could be owned by almost anyone. A sluice required more effort and materials. Hydraulic mining required larger systems of water and machinery. Hard rock mining required still more: the ability to break rock, remove it, crush or process it, and continue work even when returns were uncertain. It was a form of mining less suited to the lone newcomer and more suited to organized labor and investment. This progression did not mean that all older methods vanished at once. Panning, sluicing, hydraulic mining, and hard rock mining overlapped. Different miners used different techniques depending on location, resources, and opportunity. But the overall direction was unmistakable. The gold rush began as a rush toward visible, accessible streamside gold. It became a transformation of water rights, labor systems, equipment, hillsides, and river basins. Later, dredging carried the same industrial logic into another form. Dredging meant working through river deposits and sediment on an even larger mechanical scale, using machinery to process material that earlier miners could not profitably handle by hand. Like hydraulic mining and hard rock mining, dredging showed that the rush did not end when the first surface claims were exhausted. Instead, the search adapted. If gold was too dispersed for a pan, machinery could move more material. If the riverbed had already been worked, machines could rework it. If the richest deposits were gone, capital could make lower-grade deposits worth pursuing. This is why the phrase gold rush can be misleading if it suggests only a brief fever of individual prospectors. The rush was also a long process of technological escalation. Each step answered a problem created by the step before it. The first arrivals took the most accessible gold. More arrivals increased competition. Competition encouraged more efficient systems. Efficiency demanded equipment and organization. Equipment and organization demanded money, water, and labor. The result was not just mining, but industrial extraction in a region newly drawn into United States power and global migration. The human meaning of that shift was uneven. Those with access to capital, materials, or claims could expand their reach. Those without them could be pushed into wage labor, marginal ground, or exclusion. The same landscape that had seemed open in the early language of opportunity became structured by ownership, machinery, and control over resources. The work of mining changed, and so did the kinds of people and institutions that could dominate it. Water was central to nearly every stage. It had carried the placer gold into stream beds. It allowed the pan to separate heavy gold from lighter sediment. It ran through sluices. It powered the destructive force of hydraulic mining. It was redirected, controlled, and fought over because without water, much of the mining economy could not function. In this sense, the gold rush did not simply take gold from the land. It reorganized relationships among land, water, labor, and capital. That reorganization also changed the meaning of places like the South Fork of the American River. The river near Coloma had once held the small flakes that James W. Marshall noticed in the Tailrace at Sutter's sawmill on January 24, 1848. By the time mining methods expanded, rivers across the gold country were not only sites of discovery, they were tools, waste channels, power sources, and carriers of debris. The water that made mining possible also carried mining's consequences away from the immediate claim and into a wider watershed. The industrial turn of the gold rush therefore connects the social history of migration and dispossession to the environmental history of California. The same pressure that drew people from Atlantic ports, overland trails, the Isthmus of Panama, Latin America, China, Europe, Australia, and other places also pushed miners to increase the scale of extraction. The same hunger for gold that transformed San Francisco and Sacramento also transformed rivers and hillsides. By the 1850s and beyond, the rush had become something larger than a scramble for shiny fragments in a pan. It had become a system for moving gravel, breaking rock, harnessing water, and reorganizing landscapes around mineral value. The tools had changed, but the underlying impulse remained the same: to find gold by making the land yield more than it would give easily. And once mining reached that scale, its effects could no longer stay confined to the claim. Gravel moved. Water moved. Chemicals moved. Debris traveled from the Sierra Nevada through river systems toward distant places. The industrial mining economy had learned how to process the land in enormous quantities. What it left behind would become one of the longest-lasting legacies of the gold rush: rivers burdened with gravel, sediment, and mercury. By the time mining had become an industrial system, the gold rush was no longer only a story of people entering the mountains. It was also a story of mountains entering the rivers. The same waterways that had first carried flakes of gold into reach now became channels for debris. Hillsides were cut open. Ancient river gravels were blasted loose. Sediment that had rested in place for long periods was sent downward through creeks, canyons, and river systems. What miners called progress could look from downstream like burial. Hydraulic mining made that transformation visible at enormous scale. In the northern Sierra Nevada, miners used high-pressure water to wash away gold-bearing placer gravel. The technique was powerful because it treated a hillside not as a fixed landscape, but as a deposit to be dissolved. Water became a tool of excavation. Under pressure, it could tear into banks and slopes, break apart gravel, and push the loosened material through systems designed to separate gold from the surrounding earth. This was not the slow motion of a miner kneeling at the edge of a stream with a pan. It was water turned into machinery. According to the United States Geological Survey, hydraulic mining in California's northern Sierra Nevada processed more than 1.5 billion cubic yards of gold-bearing placer gravel from the 1850s to the 1880s. That figure is difficult to picture because it belongs to industrial extraction rather than ordinary experience. But its meaning is clear enough. The gold rush moved from searching the surface to processing entire landscapes. A cubic yard is a measure of volume, but in this story, it is also a measure of disturbance. More than 1.5 billion cubic yards meant banks, slopes, and deposits taken apart in quantities that no individual miner could have imagined in the first days after the discovery at Coloma. The gold was still small. The methods used to reach it had become immense. The environmental cost followed the same logic. Hydraulic mining did not simply remove gold. It moved everything around the gold. Gravel, sand, silt, and clay all became part of the process. Much of that material entered waterways. Rivers that had once shaped the mining frontier became carriers of mining waste. The word waste can sound too passive for what happened. This was not only discarded material sitting beside a claim. It was mobile. It traveled. It settled, lifted, and moved again. It changed channels and floodplains. It connected the mountains to lower valleys through the physical movement of sediment. In this way, the gold rush rewired California's river systems as surely as it rewired migration routes and urban growth. Earlier chapters followed people moving toward the goldfields from Atlantic ports, overland trails, the Isthmus of Panama, Latin America, China, Europe, Australia, and other places. But the mining economy also created a reverse movement, debris leaving the goldfields, carried outward by water. The Sierra Nevada was not an isolated mining stage. What happened in its watersheds could travel far beyond the site of extraction. United States Geological Survey research shows that mercury-contaminated sediment from Sierra Nevada hydraulic mining traveled more than 250 kilometers to San Francisco Bay. That distance matters because it reveals the reach of the rush. A mining decision in the mountains could become a bay sediment problem far downstream. Mercury was central to this legacy because gold recovery was not only a matter of water and gravel, it was also a matter of chemistry. Miners used mercury to recover gold from sediment through amalgamation. Mercury binds with gold, allowing small particles to be captured more efficiently than they might be by gravity alone. In a mining world increasingly organized around scale, that quality made mercury valuable. But the same property that made mercury useful also made it dangerous. Once introduced into the mining system, mercury did not simply vanish when the gold was removed. It could remain in sediment, enter waterways, and become part of a long environmental afterlife. The United States Geological Survey estimates that about 26 million pounds of mercury were used for gold recovery in California, mostly in the Sierra Nevada and Klamath Trinity Mountains. 26 million pounds is another number that resists easy imagination. It is not a detail of a single camp or a single season. It is the chemical footprint of an entire mining regime. It shows that the gold rush was not only a movement of picks, pans, sluices, and water cannons. It was also a movement of toxic material into landscapes where its effects could outlast the rush itself. The Sierra Nevada and the Klamath Trinity Mountains were not merely places where miners worked. They became regions where extraction joined geology, water, labor, and chemical recovery into one system. Gravel was the material body of that system. Mercury was one of its hidden agents. Together, they help explain why the environmental story of the gold rush cannot be treated as an afterthought. At first glance, gold appears as the concentrated object of the rush, bright, portable, valuable. But to obtain it, miners handled and displaced far larger quantities of other material. The smallness of the gold intensified the scale of the disturbance. If enough gold could be found in enough gravel, then the incentive was to process more gravel. If mercury could help capture fine gold, then more mercury entered the process. The logic of the rush pushed outward: more water, more sediment, more chemical use, more downstream consequence. This is one reason the shift from panning to industrial mining matters so deeply. A pan limits the scale of action to the hands and strength of the person using it. A sluice expands that scale. Hydraulic mining expands it again, tying extraction to water systems, engineering, capital, and legal control. The land is no longer only searched. It is reorganized so that mineral value can be forced out of it. And when land is reorganized in that way, the consequences do not respect claim boundaries. The river is the connector. It links the mining face to the creek to the larger river to lowland environments, and eventually to places far from the original claim. In that chain, the gold rush becomes less a localized boom than a watershed event. That phrase carries two meanings. It was a turning point in American history, and it was also an event that physically moved through watersheds. The cost was not separate from the achievement that boosters celebrated. California's rapid growth, its boom cities, its routes of movement, and its political incorporation all depended in part on the wealth, expectations, and infrastructure generated by mining. But the same system that made gold recovery more productive also made its damage more durable. San Francisco and Sacramento grew from the rush. So did channels of sediment and mercury that reached beyond the mines. Seen from this angle, the story that began at a sawmill tailrace comes full circle in a darker form. At Coloma, water carried away from a sawmill mechanism exposed a few flakes that redirected human attention toward the Sierra foothills. Later, water was deliberately pressurized and weaponized against the landscape to reach gold at industrial scale. At first, the river revealed. Then mining made rivers carry the consequences. The gold rush was never only about what people took from California. It was also about what extraction put back into California's rivers. gravel, sediment, and mercury, moving through connected environments long after the first excitement had passed. The evidence left in those waterways is part of the same history as the trails, ports, boomtowns, state seal, and statehood debates. It is the material trace of a turning point. By following the debris downstream, the outline of the larger transformation becomes clearer. A discovery in Coloma at Sutter's sawmill in Coloma helped turn California into a global destination and a United States priority. But it also helped create new systems of labor, capital, violence, and environmental change. The gold did not simply draw people west. It changed what the West was expected to become and what its rivers would be made to carry. Following the debris downstream gives us a way to see the gold rush whole, not as a single moment of discovery, not only as a rush of men with pans, or a line of wagons on the California Trail, or a harbor crowded with ships. Those images matter, but by themselves they can make the story feel scattered, as if California changed through a series of separate events. A find in a tail race, a treaty, a presidential message, a migration, a boom city, a state seal, a mining technology, a poisoned river. But the evidence points to something more connected. At Coloma, on the South Fork of the American River, James W. Marshall found gold on January 24, 1848, in the tailrace of Sutter's sawmill. The place was known to the Nizanan as Coloma, a beautiful valley. The sawmill was part of John Sutter's expanding world of Sutter's Fort and New Helvetia, an ordinary project of lumber, settlement, labor, and water power. The tailrace itself was not built to make history. It was a channel to carry water away from the mill mechanism. And yet that channel became the opening point of a transformation. Within days, California's political future was being fixed in another document. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed on February 2, 1848, transferring California from Mexico to the United States. That timing created one of the central contradictions of the gold rush. Gold was discovered almost exactly as California became a United States possession. A conquered province became, almost immediately, a mineral prize. The discovery did not become a mass movement all at once. Rumor moved first. News traveled unevenly. Then, on December 5, 1848, President James K. Polk confirmed the reports of California gold in his annual message to Congress. That confirmation mattered because it changed the status of the story. Gold in California was no longer just camp talk, port gossip, or an uncertain report from the Pacific edge of the continent. It was official knowledge, spoken by the President of the United States to Congress. By spring 1849, that knowledge had become motion. The National Park Service describes about 25,000 migrants on the California National Historic Trail that year. The 49ers moved overland by wagon and on foot. Others sailed from Atlantic ports around Cape Horn. Others took the combined sea and land route through the Isthmus of Panama, crossing the narrow land bridge and boarding another vessel for the Pacific. These routes did more than bring people to mining country. They redrew California's connections to the rest of the world. Missouri River departure points, eastern cities, Latin American ports, Pacific shipping routes, and the Isthmus crossing became part of the same urgent geography. Gold rewired distance. California had been remote in the political imagination of the eastern United States. After the discovery, it became a destination powerful enough to reorganize risk. People accepted dangerous crossings, long voyages, disease, debt, uncertainty, and absence from home because the possibility of gold seemed to make the journey worth taking. The West was not merely a frontier to be settled over generations. It became a place to be reached quickly, claimed quickly, and converted quickly into property, profit, and political power. San Francisco showed that transformation in urban form. A small port town became, by 1849, a boom city of tent houses, hotels, stores, saloons, gambling halls, and shanties. The National Park Service places its population at about 25,000 by that year. The city's growth reminds us that mining was only one part of the gold rush economy. The rush also created markets for food, lodging, transport, tools, credit, entertainment, shipping, and speculation. Many fortunes depended not on finding gold in a stream, but on supplying those who tried. Sacramento and the inland routes reveal the same pattern. Sutter's world had been anchored by Sutter's Fort and New Helvetia, but the rush turned that region into a gateway. Goods, people, animals, and expectations moved toward the Sierra foothills. The mining camps depended on supply lines, and the supply lines depended on cities, ports, roads, boats, and merchants. Gold in the mountains helped make the lowlands more valuable. It pulled settlement, capital, and conflict into new arrangements. Then came statehood. California was admitted to the Union on September 9, 1850. California State Parks states that the gold rush hastened that admission. The word Eureka, meaning I have found it, appeared on California's state seal from 1849 as California sought statehood. In that motto, discovery became identity. A phrase associated with finding something was made into a political emblem for a new state. But the same rush that built state power also deepened human catastrophe. California was not empty when gold seekers arrived. It was home to native nations, including the Nisenan people of Coloma, and to communities shaped by Spanish and Mexican histories. For Native Californians, the gold rush was not a story of opportunity. The Smithsonian National Museum of American History describes destroyed Indian villages, redirected waterways, depleted food supplies, and the near destruction of the Nisenan among native cultures affected by the rush. The Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian frames the gold rush era as central to understanding whether United States actions against California Native Americans meet the United Nations definition of genocide. That evidence changes the moral center of the story. The gold rush cannot be understood only through migration, enterprise, and statehood. It must also be understood through invasion, dispossession, violence, and the collapse of food systems. The same movement that made California a magnet for newcomers made native homelands vulnerable to destruction. It was also global from the beginning of its mass phase. Migrants came from Latin America, China, Europe, Australia, and other places. Chinese immigrants began arriving in 1849 and called California Gumsan, Gold Mountain. The Smithsonian National Museum of American History states that some 20,000 male immigrants arrived from China in 1852 alone. That scale makes the gold rush a Pacific world event, not just an American east-to-west migration. California became a meeting point of empires, markets, languages, ambitions, and exclusions. As the easy placer deposits became harder to reach, mining changed again. The solitary pan gave way to sluices, hydraulic mining, hard rock mining, and later dredging. Extraction became more capital-intensive. It required equipment, organized labor, water systems, and the power to alter land at scale. The logic of the rush shifted from finding gold in a stream to forcing whole landscapes to yield it. That shift left one of the clearest material records of the era. According to the United States Geological Survey, hydraulic mining in California's northern Sierra Nevada processed more than 1.5 billion cubic yards of gold-bearing placer gravel from the 1850s to the 1880s. Mercury was used to recover gold, and the United States Geological Survey estimates that about 26 million pounds of mercury were used for gold recovery in California, mostly in the Sierra Nevada and Klamath Trinity Mountains. Those figures belong to the same story as Marshall's flakes in the Tailrace. They show what happened when a discovery became an industry, and an industry became a landscape system. Hillsides were washed down. Gravel entered rivers. Mercury attached itself to sediments and moved through waterways. The downstream path completes the arc. United States Geological Survey research shows that mercury-contaminated sediment from Sierra Nevada hydraulic mining traveled more than 250 kilometers to San Francisco Bay. That distance is not just a measurement. It is a reminder that the gold rush did not remain where it began. Its consequences moved outward through trails, ports, law, labor, cities, native homelands, river channels, and bay mud. From Coloma to San Francisco Bay, the story is one of connection. A sawmill tail race helped transform California's political status. It accelerated migration networks that tied the Pacific coast to the Atlantic world, the interior trails, Latin America, China, and other global routes. It helped turn San Francisco and Sacramento into essential nodes of commerce and movement. It hastened statehood and gave California a motto of discovery. It intensified violence against native communities and contributed to the near destruction of the Nisenan. It shifted mining from hand labor in streams to industrial systems that remade rivers and carried mercury far downstream. The gold rush rewired the American West because it changed what people believed the West was for. Before the rush, California was already a place of native homelands, Mexican-era settlements, ranchos, missions, and contested sovereignty. After the rush, it was increasingly imagined by the United States as a place of extraction, settlement, transportation, incorporation, and wealth. That imagination had power. It moved people. It justified claims. It built cities. It damaged communities. It altered rivers. And so the ending of this story is not only at Coloma, where the discovery is preserved at Marshall Gold Discovery State Historic Park. It is also in the sediment carried away from the Sierra Nevada, in the political map of the United States, in the history of San Francisco Bay, and in the memory of native communities whose worlds were violently remade. The first glint of gold was small enough to hold in a hand. The consequences were not. They spread through the continent, across the Pacific, into Congress, into mining law and labor systems, into city streets and riverbeds. The gold rush did not simply bring people west. It reorganized movement, power, and expectation around the idea that land could be rapidly converted into wealth. And in that sense, the Tailrace at Sutter's mill was more than the place where gold was noticed. It was the place where a local discovery began to reveal a much larger future, a West drawn tighter into the United States, opened to global migration, scarred by violence, accelerated by capital, and marked in its rivers by the long afterlife of extraction.